Hi. In the last video, we did a close reading and examination of a line in Higgs' Journal number 23, where Higgs laments his failures using a misquote of a line from Shakespeare's Macbeth. We did this to emphasize certain incongruences in the reference's usage that will act as a kind of doorway for us to begin questioning the reliability of what we're seeing in the narrative. In this video, and in the next few videos, I want to accomplish a few things using this moment in the narrative as a starting point. First, I want to begin building the ethos of our methodology. So in this video, we're going to be discussing some foundational literary theory, and a bit about how to employ these theories in a more rigorous examination of Death Stranding. In particular, this discussion will center around the broader topics of diegesis and mimesis, and how to distinguish between the two, and some ways of employing them effectively in theorycraft. In the next video, we will take the concepts we learn in this video and go even a few steps deeper, looking at complex diegesis and really digging in deep on the use of intertextuality in Death Stranding, but also in Hideo Kojima's previous work. Then we'll move on to things like character study, author study, and some of the other bog standard literary theory methods. But more than that, I really hope that this video can kind of be a turning point in the conversation around Hideo Kojima's writing. Like, if I'm successful in communicating the things I intend to get across in this video and in this series as a whole, then this is hopefully the beginning of the end for the discussion on whether Hideo Kojima is a bad writer or not. I mean, not to spoil it or anything, but he definitely is not a bad writer. And by the end of this series, I hope to fully demonstrate how absurd that notion is. So, first, some simple definitions of diegesis and mimesis. Diegesis. Diegesis is that which is explicitly stated or shown to occur in-world in a narrative. Special emphasis on in-world. It isn't just anything that's in the text, it's anything that's actually going on in the world of the story itself. In literature, it's the story as told by the narrator. In film, it's the world that's internal to the story that is acted out in scenes. It's the events the characters explicitly experience, the actions they explicitly take. Some elements of a scene in film or literature can be non-diegetic as well. Chapter headings are a good example in literature. A great example in Death Stranding is the difference between the song being played when Sam enters Hartman's lab versus the one that you hear when you fly down the hill to Port Knot City for the first time. The music in Hartman's lab is diegetic because it is happening in-world. The characters are aware of it. They hear it along with us. However, on the hill to Port Knot City, Asylums for the Feeling is only playing for us in order to highlight Sam's mindset. Mimesis. Mimesis means to mime or mimic, to represent or reflect. Mimesis is what is shown through actions as opposed to what is said specifically or explicitly, either by narration or just by the character's diegetic experiences playing out in such a way so as to reflect or mirror or mime some other aspect of life, or some aspect of the characters, or some aspect of you, the reader, some aspect of society, some aspect of nature. Mimesis provides information about a story that isn't explicitly pointed out by the narrative. Mimesis is what we looked at in the last video with the examples from Shakespeare. In one example, the mimesis tells a very different story depending on how the play is staged, or how the actors perform, how the roles are cast, or how the director has interpreted the work itself. In both cases of Hamlet, the directors are all using the same set of diegetic material as one another, the material we looked at in the first folio, but they're producing two different results. They mime two different tales. One a tragedy of madness, one a tragedy of revenge, both a tragedy of obsession. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Animal Farm. Diegetically, Animal Farm is about a bunch of animals, farm animals, rising up and rebelling against a human farmer in hopes of creating a kind of animal utopia. So that's the diegesis. But the mimesis, meaning what is shown, what is mimed, what is acted out, is a reflection of the Russian Revolution of 1917. The animals, the characters in the story, are miming out real actions that were taken during the Russian Revolution. So for example, the Battle of the Windmill in Animal Farm mirrors the Battle of Stalingrad, now one in visual art, The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli. So an image has a lot less diegetic material than a novel, right? In this case, we have a sleeping woman on a chaise. We have a weird, creepy horse. We have a creepy troll guy just kind of sitting on her chest. And the woman is sort of lying sort of in a tortured posture. Her eyes are closed, likely because she's sleeping. And those are the primary diegetic elements. But what does the mimesis show you? Well, the mimesis is the fear and anxiety produced by having a nightmare. Having these juxtapositions of figures in the positions they're in is what creates that mimesis. Nobody has to tell you necessarily that this is an image of of what it's like to have a nightmare, you can kind of just see it, right? Another example, wander above the sea of fog. What is the diegesis? A person standing on some rocks, they're faced away from the person viewing the work of art. Their stance seems resolute. They're in what appear to be regimental garb. They got a badass sword. They got a high and tight haircut, and they're staring out on a vast wilderness covered in fog. So that's the diegesis, but what's the mimesis? To me, the mimesis is resoluteness. It's bravery, it's courage. And courage in the face of what? Courage in the face of nature, of the unknown in nature. The fog is obscuring all the details of what lies down in the valley. But the central figure couldn't care less. They're ready for the adventure. They're prepared. They woke up this morning, they had their fucking Wheaties, they had their fucking coffee, they had their iced latte, and they're ready to fucking go. Now, we could go into way more depth with either of these examples, right? We could talk in intricate detail about all the clothes and the art style and the framing of everything, but each one of these could be a video unto itself. In fact, there probably already is one on the internet. So instead, let's look at another example in depth. This is a poem by Imagist poet William Carlos Williams called The Red Wheelbarrow. You may have run into this one in school or maybe college. It's a pretty common poem to run into in like an intro to lit class. The reason I've chosen it is because it has very little diegetic material to analyze. So it isn't hard to go real deep on this one. It only has so much depth. All we have is just these 4 stanzas, couplets. So let's do a reading. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Simple, basic. Okay, so all the diegetic information we have is that there's a red wheelbarrow that's got some rainwater on it and there's some white chickens nearby. And then there's this more abstract stanza that begins the poem. So much depends upon. It's restricted to just a few key concepts. And I want to demonstrate how with a close examination of those symbols, I want to show that if we just stay grounded in what is diegetic to the poem and ask a few critical questions, we can actually formulate a better image of what we're looking at in the poem. We can come up with the answer of what the poem's actually about. So let's start with the first stanza. So much depends upon. What other diegetic material can depend? Can a wheelbarrow depend? I mean, you could say it depends upon a farmer to be used or a manufacturer to be made, but it doesn't depend on anything else in the poem. Can it depend on chickens? Nope. Chickens can't use a wheelbarrow. Can a wheelbarrow depend on rainwater? I mean, no. In fact, rainwater is potentially bad for the wheelbarrow. It could cause rust. Same for the rain. The rain doesn't depend on chickens or wheelbarrows to fall, does it? The chickens, however, while having no specific reason to depend on a wheelbarrow alone, they may have a reason to depend on rainwater. Chickens are alive. They need to drink water to survive. But the poem doesn't say so much depends upon the water. It says so much depends upon the red wheelbarrow, and it's precisely because it's glazed with rainwater. If the water from the likely recently passing rain had hit the ground, it would have been absorbed and the chickens wouldn't have access in order to depend on it, right? So now we have a little bit of an image formulating in our head, an image of a wet wheelbarrow, and for some reason the chickens are depending on it for water. So let's take it a step further and ask, why would the chickens depend on the water in the wheelbarrow? If this is a place where there is a wheelbarrow and chickens, isn't it reasonable to assume it's a farm or some rural area where somebody at one point was using that red wheelbarrow? I mean, this isn't happening in the lobby of a fancy hotel. I think it's a fair assumption to make that this is more of a farm area. So in a situation like that, what could make the chickens depend upon the water in a wheelbarrow as opposed to the water that they would likely be furnished by, say, a farmer? Why wouldn't the chickens just depend on their caretaker for water? Could the wheelbarrow explain where the farmer is? I mean, no, only that it was left there by one, probably. Can the chickens explain where the farmer is? No, because they're stuck dependent on the water. But perhaps the rain could explain it. Perhaps something about the rain kept the caretaker from getting to the chickens that day. Maybe the caretaker just don't want to go outside and get wet. Maybe the rain was actually a much worse storm than we imagined initially. And oh no, the rain got the farmer. But the farmer's not diegetic to the poem, right? So we're kind of assuming a farmer exists. And we're only assuming the farmer exists through what? Through mimesis. Because it's more likely that this is a rural area where there would be a farmer. And that those chickens would have a caretaker, especially because a wheelbarrow exists. So now that we've looked at some examples, I just want to point out how interesting it is that if we stay grounded in only diegetic material as the basis for our broader analysis, and as the basis for our more mimetic interpretation of a work of art, can generate really similar imagery, can produce very similar results in how we perceive a work of fiction. Just look up the red wheelbarrow and do like a Google image search. Look at visual artists' take on the red wheelbarrow. I mean, they're all basically the same. Some are more interesting than others. This one is formulating a mimesis where it has actually embodied in its adaptation of the red wheelbarrow the farmer that we talked about. And I don't know, is the farmer just being lazy that day? Is just doesn't give a shit about the chickens? Doesn't seem like much is stopping them. Anyway. Now, the basis of our methodology is this theory, right? And our process is just critical thinking, and it all works just like a puzzle. It requires the same kind of approach as if you were just taking on a puzzle. You know, you have to think about what you're seeing long enough to make the connections and formulate that consistent image. This is what allows you to answer the question that the diegesis is posing. This is what allows you to hear the author's voice. If you don't stay grounded in diegetic material, it's fine. I mean, you can create interesting works of critique that de-emphasize diegesis. But in so doing, you're not really disseminating what the author intended. You're disseminating something about yourself. You're talking about yourself and your own point of view and your own theories, and instead using the author's diegesis as the anchor for those theories. It's my feeling that it's important when formulating proper critiques to at least first remain grounded in that diegetic material, so as not to strip the author of their voice. You have to take the author at their word. You can't just see what they're laying down, notice some incongruences or notice some complexities in different places, and then throw up your hands and say, oh, they must just be a bad writer. You have to take them at their word that they know what they're doing first. You have to formulate a full exegesis, and it is that exegesis that you criticize. And it works just like a puzzle. The more complicated the diegesis, the more complicated the work, the more complex, the more difficult the puzzle, the more difficult the challenge in finding the meaning, the mimesis, what the author's trying to tell you. And if you see art this way, art becomes both puzzles and communication. It's the communication of the author's idea or ideas or ideology or perspective, point of view, what have you, that you can only perceive by truly attempting to connect with their work. And by thinking of it as puzzles, you can kind of think of the diegesis as your game map. In the red wheelbarrow, we have the game map with a complexity of, say, like Pong or Frogger. In something like Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, we have a much bigger game map, perhaps something like an NES RPG. In Animal Farm, we have something the complexity of some of the grittier FPS action games like BioShock or Stalker. And in something like Death Stranding or Disco Elysium or Elder Scrolls, Nier Automata, Baldur's Gate, we have the diegetic complexity of something like Shakespeare, Jonathan Swift, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Okay, so with all this in mind, let's go back to what I call the Mario and Princess Beach scene. This is the scene after which Higgs writes that journal, which contains the line from Macbeth. And let's see if what this scene is showing us, meaning using mimesis, let's see if what this scene is showing us is different from what it's telling us. First question, does this look like the face of a person who's about to be shot in the face? Does this look like the face of a person who is about to be forced to commit suicide? Which is kind of what we're told, right?
I guess that's taken care of.
No, it does not. Does this face match either of these faces from Macbeth? Nope, not even close. So what is this face telling us? And is there other diegetic material that we can use to help us determine what this face is telling us? Well, sure enough, there is. And it comes moments before we see this face on Higgs. Okay, so now with that recontextualization, does that change your interpretation of this scene? This doesn't look like the face of somebody who's about to be forced to face their death. This looks like a person giving a knowing glance to someone who has just signaled them that they're not in the danger that would make them look like all these other characters, that would justify the usage of this line. It also shines a very different light on Fragile, doesn't it? I mean, she's the one signaling him. So it begs the question, are you willing to look at Fragile in a different light? Because the surface implication is that Fragile just kind of gives him the choice whether to off himself or not, and he takes the easy way out, right? But if we take this signaling to mean something, the real test of whether this is the proper interpretation or not is whether this answers more questions. Specifically, whether it answers more questions than it raises. And I would argue that it does. Perhaps it explains why Fragile is so adamant about Sam not killing Higgs.
You can make the jump. You gonna come through for me?
I'll try to take him alive.
Promise me. I'm the one who finishes him off. Good. Then I'll help you get where you need to go.
Perhaps it explains why Amelie is so jumpy around Fragile. Perhaps there's some mistrust there. And if that's the case, perhaps that explains why Amelie wants to separate herself from Sam for a moment and go investigate something while he waits at the base of the hill. And this scene has a bunch of other stuff that doesn't make sense about it when you really stop to look at what's going on. Why is Bridget young? Can you think of a clear diegetic reason to explain why Bridget is young on the beach when we know that she died when she was old? And we know that people retain their look when they die. We know that because of the old woman on the beach with Hartman. Not only that, Bridget has color. And that scene with Hartman also tells us, through mimesis, that when you die and go to the beach, you look blue. That is until you are somehow reconnected with your body. In Hartman's case, it's the automatic defibrillation device. Now, the game is full of this. From the opening scene, from the trailers, to the final scene of the game. Here's some more examples. This is right after the Mario and Princess Peach scene. Why the hell is Deadman suddenly able to be invisible? Why does he have the floaty mask? How can he make it manifest out of nothing? He does it with the Luden's mask too. Well, see, now we have reason to look at Deadman in another light, right? Okay, so now that we have the concepts of diegesis and mimesis in our brains, and we've developed this basic methodology of remaining grounded in diegetic material to formulate our postulates, and by looking at just a few key points, we're already starting to see some of that narrative complexity begin to unravel. And in the next video, we're going to go even deeper with these concepts. We're going to talk about complex diegesis, specifically as it relates to intertextuality. And then we're going to just kind of, for a while, keep going down the line of attempting to subvert all of the most common complaints about Hideo Kojima's writing. That his writing is bloated, that he needs to hire a translator, that he should stick to game design, even though his game design is intrinsically linked to his narrative design, but whatever. But by doing this, we not only build Hideo Kojima's ethos, but we also build our own. If we do a good job of just demonstrating all of the things that Hideo Kojima is doing that are perfectly normal in literature, it's only then that we'll really begin to see what is beautiful and amazing about this narrative, about beyond what we've all already fallen in love with. And I hope you'll stay tuned. Thanks for watching. Bye. The three-stage process. Join Bridges 3 and make your connections. Tie your knots. A new community where your contributions will matter and where I will tell your story. Bridges 3 wants you.